Mom. I am director of what we call the Urban Equity Collaborative, and I am also director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, both of which are co-hosting today's event with Manuel Ochoa. I'm really excited to welcome Manuel as our speaker today. He's a good friend, a good colleague, and a really good planner, designer, community advocate. So honored for him to be here with us today. The Urban Equity Collaborative is a 2-year-old organization that is focused on helping, working deeply in communities and helping community to solve problems, especially around issues of dispossession and displacement. And those are the focus areas of our research and our ongoing engagement with communities. And for the past year, we've begun to focus on specific issues around climate displacement and are learning a lot about the ways in which issues of urban displacement and climate change intersect. And so part of our focus this year is just in learning, and we've invited a series of speakers that are helping us to learn more about this issue. And so it's an honor to have a close colleague at the table that can help us do that. Manuel also happens to be a senior leader in the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, which is a national network of organizations that focuses on keeping small businesses, particularly BIPOC and immigrant-owned businesses, in place in gentrifying neighborhoods. And we've also had a focus on climate displacement in our work through SBAN. So this is a nice intersection of a lot of things that I personally care about, but I know many folks here at the table are deeply engaged with. So with that, let me just introduce a few people. I'm going to start with Wesley Wiggins, who you all will interact with later because he's going to be moderating the Q&A and our discussion today. Wesley is a PhD student in public health, and he also happens to be a climate justice advocate, and a lot of his research centers on related issues. And with that, let me introduce Manuel more fully for those of you who don't already know him. Manuel is principal and founder of the Ochoa Urban Collaborative, a planning, community, and economic development firm that works with an equity lens and provides strategy, policy, and implementation services that helps people, neighborhoods, and communities revitalize and thrive. He's worked for over 30 years on issues of gentrification and displacement, disaster recovery, and housing policy. So he brings so much to this conversation, and just honored that he is here to join us today and talk about a report that just came out from the National Main Street that he co-authored, and I'm very curious to learn more. So let me hand it over to Manuel.
Thanks, Willow, for the kind introduction. And I'm really honored and pleased to be here with you all today and share this exciting, this new resource and toolkit that hopefully you all can use. I'll share the presentation. We're going to cover many different areas. So during the presentation, I invite you all to, take some notes, write down your questions for the Q&A, and then later on for the discussion, we'll be covering various areas during the presentation of the toolkit. Just a little bit about myself and the intersection with disaster recovery. Over the years, I've worked at the federal government at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but also worked for local governments as well on a number of disasters, especially Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and hurricanes in Puerto Rico. So that really brought home to me the issue on equity, or the lack thereof, in some of our disasters, and particularly on how disaster funds are distributed. And then over many years ago too, I worked with Main Street America, and formerly known as the National Main Street Center. And Main Street America works with hundreds of communities on downtown revitalization. They started out as a rural program, but they're both a rural and a urban program. So I think there's going to be some lots of points of interest to discuss today. And so with that, let's get into the toolkit. So just to start out, and I thought it was important to center the conversation on the need, and this is one of those stats that when you see it, um, really just really just jumps out, which is just to understand that 88.5 of all U.S. counties declared a natural disaster between 2013 and January 2023. So that's just when you think about that, that's just amazing. It's touching almost every part of our country. And then, one of the things that, over the decades, the National Main Street Center, Main Street America, has worked in dozens of communities after disasters, but they were increasingly hearing about more and more communities that were being affected, and of course that damages the local economy. And also just hearing the need from downtown managers about local leaders not having a plan to follow, or understanding what the roles and responsibilities that organizations like CDCs could play in a disaster. And then they were also asking about how to build more resiliently. And because the Main Street America was started at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, it really is a preservation-based approach to economic development. And so there's a concern for historic districts and historic buildings. And it's not just about the buildings, but really what the potential loss of a community's history, their culture, and their memory. And so the Main Street America was asked by the National Park Service to pull together a toolkit because they saw an opportunity to reach a nationwide network, and then beyond just commercial districts across the country and CDCs and other organizations engaged in this work. And the Park Service has a fund that they receive after every disaster. There's funding set aside from the natural disasters, from the disaster declarations. And so from the fund that was allocated for hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, Michael, and Typhoon U2, which hit Guam, that some of that funding was used for this project. And the project was a 3-year project that included national workshops, regional workshops, external, also an advisory committee, and with the idea of preparing and coming up with a toolkit that could be used easily accessible to everyone with some case studies and resources. Now, I will say that it would really was a daunting task to put together the toolkit, bringing together information from dozens of resources, trying to cull and also select what information would be most how it could be usable, how it could be easy to understand, easy to access at different points of a disaster. I would say that was really one of our biggest challenges. So really, it did take the full 3 years to put it together. And the focus is, natural disasters. So whether it's a fire or floods or hurricanes, tornadoes or earthquakes, or of course, what we experienced, this project actually started um, right before the pandemic. And then we went into the pandemic, so then we had to do everything virtually. So that was a real challenge for us. And then, of course, for small businesses and commercial districts across the country who all of a sudden were shuttered. So that also became a challenge. As I mentioned, we had an advisory committee of partners from all across the country, from different areas, whether they're local, local organizations like the Allapattah Collaborative CDC in Miami, or statewide Main Street organizations that are usually in state government, such as from Florida, California, and Texas, and Louisiana. And then we also had experts in disaster recovery like Jan Opper, and then from national organizations like Enterprise Community Partners, um, and then also LISC and Smart Growth America. So those were some of our key partners And I've had the pleasure of working with all of them for 3 years, and they really helped to contribute to this effort and advising us along the way. We also looked at some case studies as we tried to figure out what would be the best approach to the toolkit. And we met folks who experienced disasters in Denham Springs, Louisiana, that suffered from a hurricane, Miami, Florida, which is experiencing climate gentrification, Puerto Rico recovering from the hurricanes, and then Montpelier, Vermont, which many of you might remember from the devastating floods across the state. So how is the toolkit organized? So we came up with 3 sections that you could delve into: plan, and then prepare, and then respond and recover. So we really tried to be thoughtful about the organization of the toolkit and the approach. So it's really designed to meet organizations and commercial districts where they're at. So whether you're looking for resources for small business, whether you're a CDC, whether you're with local government, or whether you're a small business itself, what could you utilize from the toolkit? And depending where you were, that was the other challenge. So whether you just experienced a disaster or you really want to think ahead and try to address climate change, we wanted to think about all those needs. So, one of the things also that we were very thoughtful about too is, making sure that equity was at the center of the toolkit. Why? Because, as many of you may already know, climate change and climate change related disasters are known to disproportionately harm low income people and communities of color. So there are dozens of studies that show, and we know just by the way that we've built and our built environment, many communities of color were the only places they could build were in vulnerable areas. So they're more subject to flooding, more subject to earthquakes and different kinds of natural disasters just because of where they're located, because of the history of segregation across our country. And Main Street America did a study, the latest one from June 2024, that looking at where their districts were located, and they were surprised to find that 68% of the Main Street districts are within census tracts that are climate vulnerable. So each state that has a Main Street program designates their main streets. They have, certain criteria that they meet. So it was surprising for them. They knew that it was going to be high, but we were much surprised by just how high the number of districts are within census tracts that were vulnerable. The other thing also too about what's in the toolkit too. So sorry, let me go back here. We wanted to make sure that we had many different resources for leaders. So whether, one of the things early on, understanding that in some parts across the country, it's difficult to even say the word climate change. We wanted to make sure that we had communication tips for leaders and decision makers, about how to talk about it, but also how to move people from complacency to action. That's a real barrier. We wanted to make sure we had best practices and ideas and case studies that people could share. And then also, because this is funded by the National Park Service, what steps organizations could take and business owners about protecting cultural resources, historic properties that were vulnerable to natural disasters. And then training resource to help teach disaster preparedness, and then ideas to build and fund resilient infrastructure. Because ultimately, after all of this, too, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that communities, especially those that work with downtowns and commercial districts, knew how to access the funding. We found that many of them didn't know all the funds that were available and how to access them. So just in terms of planning, one of the things that we really understood right away is that it can be fairly daunting and trying to figure out like which plan you should use or how to go about planning. So, but the first part was what was actually the risk in your community and understanding what that was, and then assessing the available resources. And one of the things that we found that is something that you all can, that I invite you all to use, is FEMA's National Risk Index that they came out with about maybe a year ago or so, maybe a little bit more than that. And that will help you look at what the risk is in your community. So understanding that risk and being able to share that with your community members, I think there's a very visual way that they've represented it, and then to understand what your local vulnerabilities are. So really establishing a baseline is key. So first of all, understanding if you already have a disaster plan in place. Sometimes downtown organizations or neighborhood organizations aren't involved and don't even know about the plans. Um, if there are any inventories that exist of historic resources or buildings, like what does that, how old is that, for example? What partnerships are available to support planning? Have you engaged with emergency management? And then understanding too, if historic, um, for example, if you have a historic commission or your or your community is a certified local government, there are funds that you can access that are available if you are certified local government for historic resources, for example. So really understanding, first of all, what that inventory is. And this is one of the things that we really heard loud and clear early on, that understanding what your buildings are in your historic district, who your small businesses are before the disaster really saves time and stress, because during the disaster it could be dangerous. There could be, if you're going out to other areas outside of your downtown to assess your community, some of the buildings might have been lost, and so you can no longer photograph them if they're key aspects of the building or building materials, then it's more difficult to do after the disaster. So really doing this before, and you want to be, you really want to be more concerned about the immediate cleanup and helping people rather than worrying about buildings. But after the immediate recovery, because of the significant cultural loss, um, that could come from that, that it might be too late to do that. So really doing that earlier is important. One of the things that you'll find on the toolkit is the National Main Street Center also has a mapping tool that's available, so you can do inventory. It's called Booms, and it's a handheld. So basically, it's an app that you can download, and it's an easy way to be able to inventory your building. So this is one great tool that was recently created and is available through the website. The other important piece, as I mentioned earlier, is the communications piece. And we really found that there's actually a whole chapter on communication, because first of all it's important, who understanding who your partners are. You have to foster your relationships, if you making sure, especially with equity being at the center of it, you really have to be intentional about that. And so before the disaster, you really want to spend some time making sure that you're communicating with diverse groups, especially neighborhoods adjacent to downtown, and also making sure that you prioritize your solutions over the awareness. So how you talk about that, and building those relationships with county emergency management, to show them your value. So they're supposed to engage with community groups. They don't always do. So really, I would invite you to make sure you reach out to them and that they know who you are, and what value you bring to the community and helping spread the word on the, especially on the response and recovery piece of this. The other piece too that we really talked about and started, had a lot of discussions is how to talk about climate change. Um, Even though there's a preponderance of science on that climate change is a real thing, in some parts of the country, it's still hard to talk about. So I would, one of the things that we advise is not to argue with the skeptics, but just really focus on the frequency and the severity of disasters. They are happening, and so talking about what those impacts are. It's also important to determine where your community is willing to start the conversation. You don't want to have a conversation on disaster planning right after the recovery, and your community might not be ready for scenario planning, but they might be ready to have a conversation on how to prepare small businesses for the next disaster. So that's one, I think that was one important piece that we learned. And then making the economic case for preparation. So sharing that information and the stats is important. And then steps to protect the downtown economy and the places people love. So it's, both the data and also the stories and the people and places that the places that people find important. The other piece that we talked about too on communication is the term resilient can be very fraught in certain communities, and it's understandable when vulnerable communities in communities of color are experiencing disasters over and over, and and people are talking about resiliency and asking them to be resilient. So talk about resilient buildings and resilient infrastructure and not resilient people. We don't have to tell them that they're resilient. They are resilient. Um, but it's not so much about the expectation about the people, but resiliency and infrastructure and buildings. Having a disaster plan, a communications plan that includes both the what's your internal list for your organization? If your cell phones don't work, how are you going to communicate with people? And making sure that you have a backup plan for those disruptions, as well as the external coordinating with local media and sharing information in multiple channels, whether social media that's available to you or just, old-fashioned flyers and pamphlets if that's what you need to do to communicate. You need to think about all those things. The other piece of it too, we really helped to curate um, different and looked at many different kinds of disaster plans, and they all have their strengths and their weaknesses. Or what their best way to use them, who they're best used for, and that's something that you'll find in the toolkit. One of the things that we like that was it's very easy to use because it's ready-made with PowerPoint slides, training materials, and training tools is the FEMA's Ready Business Toolkits. And it's really more about the how to encourage business continuity planning, what are the different steps. So there's really valuable information and it takes you step by step. It's important to note, as you see here, that 3 years after a disaster, 75% of businesses without a continuity plan will fail. So having a continuity plan and thinking about what all those steps are ahead of the disaster um, is important to talk to all your local businesses about that. As I mentioned to you, depending on where you're at, and depending on what the need is, if your community is ready to talk about thinking about the future and how a disaster or different kinds of disasters will affect your community, and you have a university or a college, a local government to partner with, I would highly encourage you to look at exploratory scenario planning. It can be fairly daunting. It can require a lot of preparation. So if you're a small organization, partnering with a university or a college or a local government that has access to GIS maps or information that will, that will make, or that'll be necessary for the planning that you'll need. But it is very much worthwhile to thinking about various scenarios that could affect your community. We also have a link to a nonprofit disaster prep manual. So the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits has been doing disaster training for nonprofits across the state for a couple of decades. Oklahoma, of course, suffers from tornadoes. And so they were really intentional. They've spent a lot of time. It's easy to use as well. And then we also had another partner that came up with a online tool. There is a low cost to it, but it is a business toolkit. So that small businesses can use, and it takes them step by step. So that one is also worthwhile. So just as far as too, in the next step, when in terms of preparing, I've mentioned the strong partnerships that you need, and thinking about, your local organization and who you might partner with, such as with, translators. If you have people in your community or your volunteers, your organizations that can help, where English is a second language, who your financial providers are, your CDFIs, as well as, of course, your local banks, and then knowing who your disaster recovery manager are. There is a whole slew of partners. One of the things that we found with Main Streets is that oftentimes they weren't necessarily connected to them, and they should be, even though they're at the center. Some are, but some aren't. And so connecting with those partners, and especially the state and county emergency management, and being on their radar is important. The other thing too that we found is that, and especially in communities across the country, both urban and rural, it's like, who are the unexpected partners that you may find? In a rural area, it could be, farmers and agricultural workers who have access to the big equipment, or maybe construction companies that can help, that can come in handy in the removal of debris, or also come in handy, for example, in pulling together volunteers for, for whether it's a food gathering, for a soup line, or collecting clothes. You really need to think about, if you're a CDC or an organization, how to be prepared for the possible donation of items like clothing, or items for infants or children. How are you going to collect that? Where are you going to store it? So those are some of the things to think about ahead of time. And then also thinking about how to reduce some of those vulnerabilities within your commercial district. So, for example, it could be things as simple as the tree limbs near utility lines, clearing out and repairing block storm drains, and removing combustible material from buildings. Those are some simple things, but yet important, that could exacerbate a disaster if they're not taken care of. The other thing that we spent a lot of time on, and this is something that was at the heart of our regional workshops and trainings, was helping communities to identify needs, and then to map them, and then prioritize them. So what those needs are in a downtown or neighborhood commercial district, as far as like infrastructure, where they could be bolstered or improved, whether it's a canal like in Louisiana, where we visited Homa, that it was subject to flooding that could flood the downtown. Whether you're a community in an area that's subject to potentially forest fires that's far from the center, but yet as we've heard, things like the underbrush that catches fire can cause really severe fire. So what are some of those things that make your communities vulnerable that could affect your district? And so what are those needs? And then mapping them, and then how you prioritize them, is a key piece of doing that ahead of time, and to prepare, and doing that before and not after a disaster. The other thing in the other item that you'll find lots of information in the toolkit is on funding and available resources. So we divide it from in different areas. So we talk about the FEMA grants, National Park Service grants, as well as SBA, and then the whole slew of funding that's available from the the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that came out several years ago. That funding is a huge investment. It's one of the largest investments in infrastructure in our nation's history, but it does have a timeline, and it will be expiring in the next couple of years. So that's something to definitely get on top of, especially for building resilient infrastructure. So those are larger investments that will take partnerships with your state and local government. The other piece we talked about, as I mentioned to you, is also thinking about your volunteer networks and capitalizing on that. These volunteer networks can be key in the disaster recovery. And so thinking ahead on who those volunteers are, how you train them, how you engage them, where they'll be involved, understanding what their capabilities are, where they're willing to donate their time and their professional backgrounds, or just volunteering, whether it's something as simple as helping to distribute food or items, or whether they're willing to volunteer some of their time as a professional, as an engineer or what have you. So really understanding what that network looks like. And then the other piece that we found from one of our case studies is how you handle donations of goods and money. So we heard that communities many times were overwhelmed by the number of donations, and especially the disasters that get national attention. People from all over the country might be sending you clothing items, and so really thinking about how you're going to store that, where you're going to put it. Is it what the community really needs? So do people really need sweaters in a part of the region that doesn't that doesn't get really experience cold weather? So really thinking about that and being able to put what be able to advertise what the needs are. You'll hear the Red Cross say that the easiest way to help is actually donating money. And so if you're an organization that's well known in the community, you need to figure out how you're going to receive the money and allocate that. Having a separate bank account for that is going to be really important. How you manage the donations that you may receive. One of our case studies that I'll share with you is Chattahoochee, Florida, which is in the Panhandle, and it's close to the Georgia line. It's a small community that was never experienced hurricanes before, and at least not severe damage. So certainly, maybe tropical storms primarily, but Hurricane Michael really devastated them. There were still hurricane force winds at a Category 2 when the hurricane hit Chattahoochee. So there was a lot of destruction. And they were one of those communities. This is where one of our lessons learned about surveying before the disaster. So they did not have a survey of their buildings. And so right after the disaster, it was very difficult for them to account for some of the buildings that were lost. So it really takes a lot of research to try to find old photographs and try to piece it together. Some of the buildings were lost altogether, and they didn't have any photographs, so there was no way to rebuild them or bring them back in the same way. And then the other recommendation from the organization was thinking about how you store important documents. So storing them in waterproof containers, not just our regular old file cabinets, which were damaged, actually is something else to think about for your local organization. And then finally, from the respond and recover. So, after, assessing the damage, that's part of the focus of this chapter, coordinating the relief efforts, and then prioritizing the critical needs. One of the things that we heard over and over right away is making sure that you can help your small businesses or residents apply for the FEMA and SBA funding as soon as possible. It's important for them, it's important for individuals and families to and businesses to contact insurance right away. And there are local and regional grants that are available for cleanup. So making sure that you save receipts and it's helping to support businesses and navigating those claims would be a valuable effort on your organization's part. So that would be an important step that in helping them navigate through the FEMA and SBA process. Assessing the damage, so photographing the damage and is important. We have some tips in the toolkit about how to take good photographs. Those will be key when you talk to your insurance, and then later on, for whatever the insurance doesn't pay, applying for federal funding. And then since the focus of our toolkit is around historic buildings and districts, we have a lot of tips on what the preservation standards are. We also think it's highly important that that communities and businesses seek a preservation professional as well. We found that there's a lot of damage. People are well-intentioned, but we recommend resisting the repair of masonry and other historic features during the cleanup process. And so being well informed about what to do, we have tips on that because the damage may be expensive to repair or irreversible. The other piece to think about, and since again, the heart of our toolkit is for not only historic districts, but those small businesses in the districts. And this applies for anyone, whether you're in a historic district or not, is how are you going to help your small businesses? So really thinking about these three ways of, what's the marketing support that they can receive? How can they adapt their operations? And here's an example of a building that wasn't damaged. And so several businesses were able to use the space to be able to have temporary operations. So, how you go online so that the residents can still support, customers can still support a small business is important. And then helping them with the recovery funding. What are those pathways? How do you apply to help them get on their feet? We also heard a lot about the trauma that communities experience because disaster recovery is long. It can be overwhelming. So, your community, as in this is one of those other partnerships, is making sure that you can connect with mental health resources, building social support networks, opportunities for the community to gather. We heard a lot about different examples of small events and to build camaraderie and build community support. And then for those of you who lead organizations, we thought and we heard it's very important not to forget the self-care because there is burnout that can happen because and those of you who work in nonprofit organizations, do so much and often try to do a heroic effort, but that can also lead to burnout. So really having a good support system, having a good team, and giving yourself some time to walk away periodically is actually important because you can't keep it up for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months without taking a break. And then looking at the long term about how we build back more resiliently and build back better from before. So working from a plan and working from your priorities, understanding what the vulnerable infrastructure is, whether it's streets that are subject to more flooding, buildings that haven't been strengthened enough for that are still vulnerable to earthquakes, and then researching all the funding avenues and understanding what they are. Because as I mentioned, we are in the funding is still available. It is a historic infrastructure investment that's a down payment toward the future to building more resiliently. But many of those funds are not available to nonprofit organizations directly. So really working with your local, regional, and state partnerships is going to be key. And then just think about how you are inspired, like finding good examples. And some of these things are hard to see. So, on the left, in, San Simeon, California, this building was retrofitted for earthquakes. It is expensive. And then on the right, building things like stormwater management as part of your streetscape is something that people do see. And then be creative. So because of the increasing effects, whether it's sea level rise or potential flooding, how you're creative in protecting buildings, as you can see here in the front of this building, there are these low walls to protect the entrance from flooding or even elevation. And one example of that is Charleston, South Carolina, and the Park Service also has a flood adaptation guide that you'll also find linked on our toolkit. And then be bold. It might be expensive, and you might have to think of some solutions that they may seem outlandish. So on the right, Guam, as you know, is an island in the Pacific, which is extremely vulnerable to typhoons and stronger typhoons. Some of their historic buildings they've elevated. So this is a severe example. And then on the left, you see Ellicott City, which is close by here near Baltimore. And what you don't see is the infrastructure underneath and the large pipes that they created in this underneath the streetscape to move water. Ellicott City was flooded not because the nearby, not just because the creeks rose, but because of the elevation and the slope, and they experienced a catastrophic amount of rain in a short period of time that flooded their streetscape up to, if you can look at that picture, it was halfway up to the to some of those doorways and storefronts. So it was really severe damage. So we also invite you to look at some of the examples of that we have our case studies on the toolkit, and then take the time to also after a disaster, it's important to, if you have experienced a disaster, to reflect on the actual disaster and what are some of those successes and those gaps, and then think about, if you're an organization like a CDC, how can you update your own organizational plan, but also be engaged in your local disaster preparedness plan if you haven't been engaged before. But it does take advocacy to continue, and so engaging, as I've talked a lot about, building those partnerships, working in new coalitions that perhaps you didn't work in before, and really making the case for investing in resiliency. Because remember, these are large projects that take, millions and millions of dollars. They will take time to plan, take time to execute. They're going to take multiple streams of funding. And so it's a marathon, and, not a sprint. So, and I think that's important to think about. Even if you start these projects today on the planning, they may take, 5 or 6 years before they're even built or more. And so finally, I just want to leave you with some things that you can do right away. I know it's a lot of information that I shared in a short period of time, but I would just say that some immediate steps that you could take is take a look at FEMA's risk index and see where your community's at as far as how vulnerable it is to which kinds of disasters. And then think about what kind of planning is your community ready for. So do you think you're ready for an organizational disaster preparedness plan for your CDC or your organization, or the small businesses are ready to engage in some kind of disaster preparedness or business continuity planning, or are you ready for something like community-wide planning, exploratory scenario planning? And then take a walk around your neighborhood, a walk around your commercial district to look at those trouble spots and notate those, and then think about those infrastructure projects. I would invite you all to look at what's on the books, like what is it that is already in the planning stage that you may not have heard about. So engaging with your local planning department and looking at those projects and taking a second look. So if you are planning a full scale streetscape, if that's something your city is planning, is it being built in a resilient way? So taking a second look at those is something that I would invite all of you to do. So with that, here is my information. You can feel free to email me directly, and then the director of strategic projects who couldn't make it today, but she led the effort on behalf of Main Street America, Bethany Rogers, and her email is here. And you're welcome also to email her directly. So I know it's a lot of information and a lot to go through, but I'm happy to answer any questions and then engage with you all in the discussion. And hopefully you found it some of this information helpful today.
Yeah, I just give Manuel a virtual round of applause. We really appreciate you coming and telling us about this tool today. I know that I put you just mentioned the FEMA's risk index map. I just put the link to that in the chat. And I think we also have the link to the tool itself so that our attendees can access the tool. I think, Julia, can you put that in the chat? Thank you. There it is. So you can see some of these resources for yourselves. Right now, we're going to take questions for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to give Manuel and everyone here a 5-minute break so you can go take a bio break, get some water, get a snack, and then we'll come back and resume the discussion. But for right now, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or come off mute and let us hear your questions. I've got one to kick us off. Can you tell us a bit more about like the development process that went into building out this tool?
Yes, so I think the some of the key inputs for developing the tool, there was a lot of research that went into the tool, is trying to cull the information, but we were also very intentional about a lot of the regional workshops and the national workshops. We took a lot of time to actually listen to what the experiences were of the various communities, so that was helpful. And then our advisory group was also helpful in shaping like what would be useful, like what is it that people actually really need, and where could they engage, like having different places to enter um, disaster planning and resilience was very important. Yeah,
And how long was that whole process?
it really took the 3 years, and even after the second year, when we started writing the toolkit, we had the whole toolkit already written, and then we completely redesigned the structure of the toolkit to make it more user friendly too. So, and then spent a lot of time. There was like much more information. So you'll find that there are a lot of links to resources because there's so really trying to curate that. That was a really important piece on trying to make sure brevity in what we were writing was key. So you'll find a lot of links that then you can go deeper. You can go down various rabbit holes, whether you're interested in the disaster preparedness piece of it at the beginning, or you really want to get into the funding. You can do that if you want, but we don't have everything on the toolkit because it just would be 3 times as long or 4 times as long.
Manuel, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the equity piece and what makes some small businesses particularly vulnerable in the face of disaster and to the forces of displacement in the midst of climate change. And then if there are some key tools that come out of the toolkit that you would highlight that would be particularly focused on the needs of the most vulnerable businesses, I'm assuming being those owned by BIPOC or immigrant-owned businesses.
Yes, that's a great question. Um, one of the things that we heard early on, especially from communities in Puerto Rico, um, communities in Florida, or places that experience repetitive disasters, um, people were tired. I mean, I think they tired of experiencing disasters over and over. Some of them experienced multiple disasters like Puerto Rico. And so understanding and experiencing that the places that experienced the greatest damage were in vulnerable areas. So whether um, there are communities in Puerto Rico near Loíza that were right next to estuaries that were or rivers that got all of the flooding that was coming downhill from the center of the island. Those vulnerable communities were the ones that were in the way that were experienced the flooding most severely. And so I think one of the things that we thought was important was having the cultural competency, um, and making sure that the organization that is serving the area has the language capability and the cultural capability to be able to communicate. So coming from the outside, and I think that's something that we also heard about, coming from the outside to a new community was difficult. So if you are working in a local government, working with those trusted leaders was extremely important, because otherwise you would receive resistance to what you were trying to do, and distrust. So trusted leaders, trusted communities is a key approach. Language and cultural competency are another key approach. And then the other thing that we also heard was listening. It was really important to truly listen. A lot of times, federal agencies and come in with solutions, engineering solutions that aren't respectful of the history and the culture, um, and asking people to move or relocate. So there's a real sensitivity to that. And so one of the things that you'll also find in the toolkit that we heard from our friends in Louisiana was about storytelling, and the importance of capturing those stories as a way of sharing the experiences of communities of color who were experiencing disasters. So those are just a few.
I really appreciate that, especially as you know, many toolkits, including some of ours, focus on the tools first and not the process of
Right.
finding the right tool and how you work with communities, which, as you're saying, is the critical part of the process. The tool is the last thing to
That's right.
think about. And it's oftentimes the first thing that federal agencies and folks that are going in the midst of climate disaster focus on.
That's right.
We have two questions in the chat before we go on our break. The first one's from Susan A. Kern. Are there different tools for owners versus renters of property, and how did that inform your work?
That is an interesting question. So we did not, um, because the focus of the toolkit was around small business, um, and assuming that most of the small businesses were the ones who would have to undertake the planning. That was really a focus, so we didn't differentiate that. Um, I will say that I did just see, as I follow them, the National Low Income Housing Coalition did just publish a disaster recovery toolkit. Um, the author of that, Noah Patton, is someone who I work with the Enterprise Community Partners. So I would say that um, if you're interested in tools for renters versus owners, especially in resident, from a resident perspective, I would encourage you to visit the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And that toolkit is like literally hot off the press.
Yeah, thank you for that information. I'm writing that down. I just want to find all the toolkits. Um, and then I think one more question before we go to break, and then we'll take more questions after we get back. But this one's from Katie June Friesen. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Can you talk about any concerns that preventative disaster planning can exacerbate gentrification? Yeah. How can is there ways that disaster planning can exacerbate gentrification and how, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Katie. Great question. So I think in the listening at the beginning, in the planning piece of this, um, being really intentional about listening to communities of color, because in the planning piece of this, sometimes the facts might lead communities to look at solutions, local governments to seek solutions that might displace communities. So examples of that are examples in Louisiana where there are communities that are in areas that are losing shoreline every day. And so they are more vulnerable, but that is their historic home. So asking people to just completely relocate when they're not ready to do so um, can create a real controversy and create the displacement. So you want to make sure that it's a choice and not a mandate. And sometimes that just takes time. And so there's a real balance there between um, expending federal funds for repetitive loss, so that's a real issue, but also respecting the history and the culture of the community. So that takes time and patience. So that is not an easy question, but they can exacerbate. And I think many of the engineering solutions, so I think, favorite target, I think, is, Army Corps of Engineers. And, the engineers, I'm going to pick on them, aren't necessarily the most community minded. And so they just come up with solutions that for example, barriers or walls that might cut communities from each other and actually separate them because that happens to be where the flooding is happening. So really asking the hard questions and the advocacy piece of this is really key. So I think joining forces and advocating and being engaged in these processes are is an important place because they can be changed. They might be asked. I remember in Florida on Biscayne Bay, the Army Corps of Engineers was their solution was to build 15-foot walls that would visually separate the community from the bay, and they didn't want that. So they asked them to go back and come up with another solution, and they did.
Thank you, Manuel. Yeah, one of the things we've been, as you know, talking about at SBAN as we look into climate induced gentrification too, is just how some of these infrastructure investments can also make places more attractive to others, and then how that can drive up prices for folks. So that's something we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think something else too on that point, Katie, because I think it's an important question. And I think understanding into the next administration where the focus is on, deregulation. And I think two of the regulations that I think that we need to look out for, and they can be arcane, but they do protect community. And one of them is Section 4F, which is the Department of Transportation is required to mitigate the effects of transportation projects. And then the other one is Section 106 from the National Historic Preservation Act, which also is supposed to mitigate effects on historic buildings and communities. And these were all created as an outgrowth from urban renewal in the 60s. And we know the story. We know who were the communities that were most affected by urban renewal. It was communities of color. So we really have to be watchful that and making sure that these regulations still exist. These regulations have a purpose, and their purpose is to make sure that communities have a voice and have input when these proposals are being made.
Thank you for that answer. We're going to take a quick break so that we could all take a minute to stretch and, as I said, bio break, bathroom, water, snack, anything you need. We're going to come back around, time now is 1:03, so we'll come back around 1:08 and we'll pick up with Julia's question.
Great. Be right back.
Okay, it's 1:08.
And actually, so Wesley, I have a question for the group that we could ask. It would be
Oh,
good. It would be good to hear. It would be good to hear why people chose to participate in this webinar and just hear about how they intersect with the disaster preparedness and resilience. Be good to hear that from the folks who are here.
yeah, feel free to write your answers in the chat or come off of mute.
I can go. Hi, thank you so much for this chat. It's been really insightful. I work for a program called Sustainable Maryland, which is based out of the university as well. And we work with municipalities throughout the state of Maryland. And part of our program shift has been increasingly to think about how do we help municipalities like build capacity around disaster preparedness. And so this discussion is really insightful into what are the more practical approaches that people can take for that, and kind of demystifying something that often becomes so overwhelming very quickly. So really appreciate this chat, and like really looking forward to figure out how to better integrate this into our work and to the relationships that we have with our municipalities as well.
That's awesome. Great. Glad you're here. And I saw also, Wesley, that you mentioned that Julie had a question before the break.
Yes, and I also want to, if you can see the chat as well, Eric kind of put a bit of his background in the chat as well. You can see that.
He said Julia's question was about, let's see, how we navigated balancing the different values, goals, and definitions of the organizations involved, National Park Service, Main Street America, LISC, etc. That's a great question. We understand that disaster preparedness is for everyone. However, ultimately, understanding like who's paying the bills. So, in this case, it was like the National Park Service, and centering that on the historic resources. That being said, we understood that not every community has historic buildings or historic districts. However, the National Park Service chose Main Street America because Main Street America has been at the forefront about defining what is a historic building, and really that, if we had this conversation 50 years ago, historic preservationists and architects didn't think much about commercial buildings. And so I think we could also extend that same conversation about the approach to preservation that includes diverse communities and really lifting up whether it's LGBTQ buildings related to that history, or African American communities, Latino communities. So really broadening that. And so we wanted to make sure that we were really broad. And I think our partners, whether it's like Smart Growth America or LISC, we wanted to have a tool that they could also share with their networks. So we were very intentional about asking them, hey, is this useful? And how would your community find this useful? So that's how we kind of balanced it. I'm not sure that it's necessarily perfect, right? Because it's just so much. So it does definitely have a particular lens, but we I think we're proud of the contribution and just hope that others add to it, because we need much more information, and people are going to come at it from different angles and perspectives where they're at. Yeah. Let's see. Thank you. Let's see. Thank you, Susan, for your comment. I appreciate that. And let's see, one question, Eric has a question about that comes from time to time, is how to bridge the engineering, physical resilience aspect of disaster planning with social policy issues, especially around equity and differential impact. Second set of questions is often seen as secondary and the data qualitative, so they fail to be included in lots of models of planning. That's very true. And I think, as I've seen it happen over many years, I think a lot of times because some of these teams land like spaceships into communities and they don't bother to take the time to understand the context of that community. They look at the data, they look at the flooding data, they look at the damage. And so what may seem objective to them, as in, take your pick, if you remember back in Katrina, Ward 9, in New Orleans, historically, a historical African American community that was built there because of segregation in the most vulnerable part next to the wall. Objectively speaking, you would consider that the people who lived in that community should move. So the engineers immediately came up with solutions to move and relocate people. So they weren't listening up front. So I think having that quality, as you were putting it, the qualitative information, like those inputs first, and listening to the community first, and understanding whether or not they want to stay or they want to move, that should help guide the solutions rather than the other way around. And it's not always straightforward. I mean, I think I can remember my experiences at HUD through the Midwest floods, and there was a community on the Mississippi River that had that experienced repetitive floods, and they were ready to relocate. So that community did relocate to higher ground. So I think really listening is a piece of that. So putting that qualitative information first, I think, is key. Yeah. Yeah, I think you mentioned, social vulnerability indices. I don't know necessarily that it's a tool. The answer is a tool. I think the tools can help as far as understanding the vulnerability. It really, I think it's about the process, really, ultimately. That's really what it's going to be about. It's about the process. And respect, that's ultimately what it's about too. Yeah. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I would say, the definition of expansive definition of preservation and how you navigate that. I think that's definitely, I think it's challenging, but at the same time, I think there is, among communities, I think there's so much more of a expansive approach today about historic buildings and what's valuable. And I think that's also part of the input too. Again, going back to that qualitative information is like asking the community. And I think that's why I kept reiterating that it's important to take the steps about identifying, doing the survey before the disaster, because that takes time. And you may overlook a building that maybe doesn't look like much on the outside architecturally, but then it's really significant to the community. There's like a history there. Very recently I was in, and I heard about this at the preservation conference, and it's a building connected with Zora Neale Hurston in Florida, in Fort Pierce, Florida, and it was a rental property. But it also was, so from the outside of the building, it was in fairly bad shape. When she lived there, she was in dire straits financially, and frankly, he was probably like he was not a good landlord, a slumlord, you could probably say. She was not living in good conditions, but that's the place where she died. So for those, and I think she's a author of national significance, and yet many of the places associated with her don't exist, or they're limited. I should correct it. It's not that they don't exist. They're limited. So really saving that home for the community, and not only just for the community, but also for Florida and also nationally. So it's not always about the building architecture. It's oftentimes about the story and who it's associated with and what it means. And those things take time. So so that's why you want to make sure that there is intentionality and like a lot of voices because after the disaster happens and you're trying to drive around trying, okay, we need to, this survey is from like 1985 and like what's happened since then, and you're driving around and it's like and it's an obstacle course and it's dangerous, but you need to do it because um FEMA is not going to account for your historic resources if they aren't surveyed. And they're just going to tag buildings and they're going to mark them. They're going to use their process to tag buildings and they're going to demolish them if they look like every other building. So, you know, a row of buildings that could be mill houses, but one of them is associated with like the example of the significant author, that's the one you want to save. Because otherwise to them it looks the same, and those row of 10 houses are going to all be torn down, and then it's going to be too late. So that's why it's so valuable to do that um early on. Yeah.
If there are any other questions, please write them in the chat or come off of mute. Oh, I see we have one right there from hope I'm pronouncing this, but Amory Jones. I was curious through your research and conversations with community if you heard the need for disaster insurance assistance for small businesses located in areas that have frequent weather events.
There is definitely a need for small business insurance assistance for sure. I don't know that we've grappled with that properly. There have been some positive changes. So I would say, so for example, one of the changes that FEMA has recently made, which isn't exactly about insurance, but it is about disaster assistance, is allowing for home-based businesses or people who are contractors or freelancers who may have, you know, an office in a building or at home. If they experience a disaster, they can apply for the SBA assistance for small businesses. Before it had to be like a brick and mortar. So now they've changed that to allow greater flexibility given the hybrid nature of a work. So that's a positive change. But I think there is a hole in disaster insurance for small businesses that they can be, because a lot of times they don't they're not even aware they don't have enough insurance coverage. And then they also, the other piece of it is also the um, tracking and also making sure assessing the damage. So that's a key piece of it. So I would say it's also not so much, I think the greater issue is when a disaster happens, a small business may not have taken the time to properly document the damage. So I think the gut reaction is to go ahead and start cleaning up and start fixing the damage because you want to get your business going again. But that could be the wrong thing. They want to pause and make sure that all the damage has been assessed, because once it's cleaned up and it looks different, the insurance adjuster comes by um, and may give you like less money. And so then you have to wait for the federal assistance that can take a longer period of time. So I think that's actually a bigger issue. A good question.
I had a quick
Willing to, I was just gonna say, I'm also just interested in people just sharing too, just because I learn so much when folks like yourselves are sharing information about even some of the things that you're thinking about. I'd be curious just to hear on whether or not you have done, if you work in a local community, whether you have done any kind of disaster preparedness planning of any sort, small business, organizational, for your organization, for your community. I'd be curious to hear what that's been like.
I'll say here in DC, and actually one of the previous UBC workshops we had, the Ward 7 Community Resilience Hub, uh, sorry, Resilience Hub Community Coalition. There it is. They actually stopped by and talked a bit about their process of working with the DC government, as well as I think through NOAA grants, to stand up the one of the first resilience hubs within DC in one of the flood prone areas, um, which has been going on for like I believe the past 4 or 5, maybe even more years. And they do a lot of work hosting events for their community, but also like providing assistance for helping with disaster planning and training.
Mhm. That's good. Yeah. Yeah, I really like, I think the resilience hub model I think is a good one. Especially if it can, engage community early, but also thinking about too about what how that hub could be available to small businesses. Um, a lot of it, and I know, and it is important, thinking about where nonprofit organizations can also do their work. So whether they're doing housing assistance or whether they're doing public health assistance, how can those organizations immediately start to work again if their normal place of business has been damaged? Where can they start to get to work? Because the most vulnerable low income families are the ones who need the help the most. And those are the ones that are going to be seeking the help. So it's important that they have a place to go to that they know that is available, that they don't have to figure out. They don't have to look it up. It's like, this is a place that I can go to in a disaster. So, and it's going to be safe. I think that's a really key intervention that I think that can be helpful for communities of color in particular. Yeah. All right. Quiet group or people munching away, possibly, maybe.
Working
Lunchtime,
right through lunchtime.
which is totally okay. I have my sandwich waiting for me also, so.
Uh, I had a quick question if no one else has anything to mention quite now, right now. But I was just thinking back to the toolkit. What are the next steps? Or is the product finalized, or are you going to go back? Are there going to be new versions? What's next?
Yeah, well, the toolkit itself has been finalized. I think it took, definitely took a lot of effort to get to this place. We really spent a lot of time on the design and being intentional about the design and the language, something that you'll see, um, because we wanted the toolkit to be something that could be used by different people, whether you're at the community, whether you're an individual from the community or whether you're a leader or you're an elected official. We want it to be usable for all those different audiences. I think Main Street America, one of the things that we're only able to do it in a very limited basis is technical assistance. And so I think as a next step, it's not necessarily rewriting the toolkit, although I'm sure that may happen because there's always new information. Um, I think it's how you take the tool and how it can be employed in a community. So and we tested that. That was the purpose of the regional workshops. We wanted to test out in the first of all the inventory of needs. So being able to sit with groups from one community and have people go through the exercise of thinking about, okay, what infrastructure needs exist in my community? and to list them out and then to prioritize them. And then at least from a very surface level, start to think about, okay, this is my project and this is how it can be funded. So obviously there are many more steps to take, but at least just from a very surface level, being able to engage with that and thinking about that was one thing. The other thing that we also experimented with were the different kinds of disaster preparedness tools. So we tested the FEMA open training tool. We tested that and also did an exercise in exploratory scenario planning. And I'm kind of curious too. I remember, who was it? Was it Amory, who was our friend from Sustainable Maryland, I think. I'm curious to see if they're thinking about, or if they have done any kind of exploratory scenario planning. I'm a big fan of that. However, you really do need a partner. Like um it's not a I don't think it's a that it would be easy for a small CDC to take on. They can't take it on their own. They can help gather and set the table, but to really be effective in scenario planning, you need a partner, whether it's at the University of Maryland that can pull the data, that can do mapping, that can like run, print GIS maps, be able to make it, use laptops that can be interactive so that people can kind of see. You have to write the scenarios ahead of time. Um, the Lincoln Land Institute, which is the who we linked with, has a lot of tools available, but then it takes the investment of becoming a trainer in that and being able to lead the planning process, because it's not just a one and done. To be really effective and do it properly, you'd probably need to organize at least like 3 or 4 meetings to and then have support to, as I said, bring data, have maps, have have meetings where people can interact, and look at information. So yeah, so that's another one, I think. Okay. Oh, I see there's a question from Liv. Liv, that's right.
Yeah, hi. It's more so just like a comment, I guess, on what you were just saying. One of the things that we've been, trying to think through with like potential ways to help integrate kind of the muscle memory needed to start thinking about resilience planning and like the frameworks, is we do leadership trainings every year. And this year, one of the discussions we're having is like, this could be an opportunity to, because usually with our leadership trainings, we bring together municipalities from across the state, and organizations as well to do panels and whatnot. But I think your point about like scenario planning and kind of the sustained infrastructure over time, and bringing in numerous partners, is something that I think I will definitely be bringing back to like my people, is like, is this an opportunity to kind of create space for kind of a higher level understanding of what it looks like to do scenario planning, and we do a lot of coalition building with like regional partners. So is it an opportunity to start thinking about that? So I think that was just like something that I wanted to like, I guess, connect back, because you did mention Sustainable Maryland. So yeah.
Great, love it.
All right. Well, I just want to thank Manuel. Thank you again for presenting a great presentation and for a great discussion. And I also want to thank everyone that is in the room right now, everyone that came today. I'm really happy. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for your wonderful questions and comments. In the chat before you all go, I just wrote not wrote, but I dropped the link to the UEC feedback survey. We'd really appreciate if you have any feedback and thoughts. We hope to host a few more workshops next semester in the spring. So it'll be great to have feedback on how we can improve our workshops. So with that, thank you everyone again, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the day.